Hey, Trail Kreitzer at goHUNT. Today I'm stoked because I've got my bow press set up here in the office. I've got a brand new bow from Mathews, and I'm going to walk you through the entire process of how to set your bow up. So first, right out the gate, we're going to pull this bow out of the box and do kind of an unboxing. This bow right here is the Mathews Atlas. So the Mathews Atlas is about a year old. And it's actually kind of a unique bow, and it's built for guys with long draws for the most part. So if you're a guy that's got a 30-inch plus draw length, this is definitely a bow that you ought to look at. This bow also is relatively long from axle to axle, so it's almost 35 inches. It's actually 34 3/4 inches long. What that's going to give you is a really nice stable platform, so this bow should hold and aim very well on target. In addition, this bow has got a 7 3/4 inch brace height. So that's that distance between the base of the grip or the burger bolt button here all the way to your string. Generally those longer brace heights are a much more forgiving bow because it's going to get rid of the arrow quicker than a bow that's got a short brace height. So these are typically very forgiving bows. It's got, like I said, long axle to axle, long brace height. This bow should aim very, very well. It should be very accurate. In addition, this bow is actually relatively fast. They IBO this bow at 350, which that's set up with a 350 grain arrow at max draw length, so 34 inches. I would suggest for somebody in that 30-inch draw range, maybe 31-inch range, you should be able to get a hunting arrow in that 460 to maybe 480 grain range, in that 280, 285 feet per second plus maybe. So it's still a relatively fast bow. So like I said, this is the Mathews Atlas. We're gonna set this thing up today, start to finish. We're gonna tie in a nocking point, D-loop, put the sight, the rest, the entire thing on, and we're gonna tune it. Right out of the box, one of the first things that I like to do with a new bow is just to give it a general inspection. So I just like to check things out, check the limb pockets, make sure that the bolts are completely turned in. One of the things I do like to check is just cam timing out of the box, and you can do that with almost any bow that you buy. Mathews bows are nice in that they've got this little timing hole right here in each cam, in the top and the bottom cam. And you're gonna see the control cable and the way that that runs through that hole. So it's a visual reference of your cam timing. So as I look at this, I can see that that cable is actually running through both of those holes in almost the exact same location. So this bow right out of the box should be very, very close to being in time, which is key to tuning this bow. I would feel really confident in taking this bow as is right now, setting up my nocking point and getting started with the full process, which is what I'm gonna do. If you needed to change this, your timing, you can certainly do that. I'm gonna touch on that as I get into the bow process. You can see if you flex the cable there, it's going to advance the cam to the rear. Rather, if I pull on the string, you can see how that impacts the cam. It's going to advance the cam. So there's things you can do with your control cables, whether it's adding twists or taking twists out to increase or decrease this cam orientation, which goes into cam timing. All right, so my first step in setting up a brand new bow is to set a nocking point. From that nocking point, I can then set up my rest and I can level it out and I can tune the bow. Over the years, I found that it's easier if I set my nocking point exactly the same distance between each cam. And I just find that that's the center pull of the bow. It seems to tune a whole lot easier, and it seems to be a much easier process if I measure exact distance halfway between each cam, because this is a dual cam bow, and set my nocking point there. So I'm going to just throw this bow in the press, and then I'm going to show you how I set my nocking point up. All right, so I put my bow in a press. I'm not pressing the bow, I'm just using that to hold the bow as I take my measurements and establish my nocking point. So for this step in the process, you'll need a tape measure. You'll also need a Sharpie. These little silver Sharpies work best because then you can see that on the dark serving. All right, so I'm gonna take this measurement. I'm just gonna slide that into this groove, measure to the other groove on the opposite cam, and I can see that I've got 31 inches. So I'm gonna set my nocking point on this bow at 15.5, which is exactly halfway between 31, so 15.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my Sharpie right here. I'm going to measure it out 15.5 inches. And as I measure that, I'm just going to make a mark on my serving at 15.5. So I've measured 15.5 inches and I've made that mark here with my silver Sharpie. So as I set this bow up and I set my nocking point, I'm going to put my arrow where that nock is sitting exactly at 15.5 inches. So right there in the center of where that mark is. And what I found after setting up bows, especially Mathews bows, is that if I do this step, I measure halfway, I set it up here, and I level this arrow, so 90 degrees from the string, I found that everything kind of lines up. Arrows tend to tune extremely easy if I do this step. The arrow's going to run right through the middle of the burger hole here, and I don't have any issues when I'm tuning. Typically I can tune a bow within a few arrows as long as I take this step when I'm first setting up my bow. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm actually going to establish and tie my nocking point in. One little tip that I like to do is I just like to take a loose nock. I'll pop that on the string and I'll take another measurement just to confirm once again that I am exactly 15.5. And like I said, I want the nocking point to be where my arrow is exactly 15.5. So the center of the nock, 15.5 inches, and I'm going to tie that nocking point in underneath it. So I'm just taking another measurement right here, kind of bump that over a smidge. That looks pretty good. So I've got a nock on the string, and my next step is going to be to actually tie a nock set on. For nocking points, a lot of people do it different ways. Some people tie one below, one above. For me, and all the bows I've ever set up over the years, I tie a single nocking point below the nock, and then I use my D-loop as the top portion, and then I'll run the D-loop on the bottom portion of the nock set on the bottom side. So first step is you're going to grab some serving. So this is some BCY number 62 braided serving. It's kind of that black and white serving that a lot of us are pretty accustomed to if you've been to an archery shop that sell it in spools. I'm just going to go ahead and cut myself off a nice little length to tie in my nocking point. The next step for me, this is just like a little tip, is I like to take some bowstring wax. So I've got some scorpion venom bowstring wax. What I like to do is just get a good amount on my finger, and I like to take the serving that I'm going to tie my nock set in, and I'm going to coat that really heavily. The reason I'm doing that is because as I tighten this nock set in, I want it to bind and have something to kind of pull itself onto. Whereas if you don't do that, it's kind of slick and it can slide. So I like that bowstring wax to get some bite to it. So when I'm going to tie my nock set in, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my piece of serving here. I'm just going to do a couple overhands. So not just one, but two. And when I do that, I'm just going to kind of work it down on the string. I'm going to work it up to that nock right there. And I'm just going to kind of pull it in. And I'm going to pull that tight. First one just tight. And then my next step, I like to double check everything that I do just to make sure that I've done it right. I don't want to do it again, so I'm just going to make sure that I get it once exactly right. So that looks pretty good. It looks like that nock's going to sit exactly at 15.5. So after I've done that, I'm just going to work this back and forth doing the same kind of knot. So I'm just going to do an over and under twice on each one and then pull it tight. All right, so as I'm tying my nocking point in, I'm doing these overhand loops underneath the string. So I'll do one here, I'll do another one. And as I'm doing them on the top and the bottom, you know, here and here, I'm kind of rotating those back and forth. And that's how I like to establish my nocking point. Eventually what I'm going to do is tie that off, and I'm going to burn that and press it down in. And it doesn't really matter too much, but what you don't want to do is to tie it loose so it slips up and down. You want to make sure those are nice and tight. And like I said, you're just walking them above and below the string, tying in those overhand knots as you go. All right, so I typically do maybe 4 or 5. I don't really ever keep track. Ultimately, what I'm looking for is just the thickness of the nock set. I don't want it super thick. I also don't want it really thin, so I don't just do a couple knots. I'll often do maybe 4 or 5, but as I look at that, you can see it's maybe 1/8 of an inch thick as far as a nocking set goes. And what you're doing there is you're just putting some space between your D-loop and your arrow. your knock, so that as you pull your bow back and the bottom pressure of that isn't pressing up into the knock via the D-loop. So I do like a knocking point. This is how I tie mine in. It's not a super complex process. Mostly it's just those overhand knots as you go. So after I've done this, I've made sure that it's done really, really tight and pulled in. I'm just going to tie a bunch more knots as I go down. I'm going to cut those ends off and just going to burn them and flatten them into the knocking point. All right, so I've tied some overhand knots, pulled those in tight. All I'm going to do now is just cut the loose ends. You want to be really careful when you're working with a knife or scissors around your bowstring. You don't want to cut your bowstring or nick it. In the same regard, when I burn these off with a lighter, you want to be aware of the direction that a flame goes, which is up. So you want to tip your string in, either away from you or into you, but you want to make sure that that flame's burning in and not directly up into your serving and your string, so you don't, damage your string. So now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of let those burn out. I want to be really, really careful to make sure that I don't put any melted string onto my serving, and I want to make really sure that I'm not actually, burning or melting my serving as I go. So I want to be really careful as I do this step. All right, so I got my knocking point established. My next step is to put on a D-loop. After that, I'll put my rest on and kind of square that up. My favorite D-loop material is this BCY braided Spectra number 23. Number 24 is also pretty commonly used. Number 23 is a little bit thinner, it's a little bit lighter, so I actually like the 23. Everybody's D-loop's a little bit different. Neville likes to shoot a little bit longer D-loop. Mine are probably, typically 3/4 of an inch or so, and you got to kind of understand or get used to what you like. But for me, like I said, I like that about a 3/4 inch loop. So I'm just going to take a piece of D-loop. I'm going to end up shortening it up probably as I burn that process down. But I'm just going to cut me a piece that looks long enough. I'll end up shortening it. And like I said, once you kind of understand and figure out what your D-loop length is that you like, you can just take a measurement as you take an old D-loop off, and then you can cut those to the exact length every time you put on a new D-loop. For this video, like I said, I'm just going to take a nice generous piece. I'm just going to make a cut. All right, so this one's a little bit long, obviously, but just for the sake of this video, you can see I got a hunk of D-loop here. One thing that I do different than a lot of people do, and everybody, like I said, they kind of like their own thing, but what I like to do is I actually like to pull the core of this stuff out. So as you look at this Spectra number 23 D-loop, you can see that it's got this internal core right here, and I actually like to pull that out. What that does is it actually makes the D-loop that much more flexible. I think for guys that are shooting handheld releases, whether you're shooting a hinge or a thumb button release, as you pull that back, you're going to put some torque in that D-loop as you turn your hand in. And as you do that, I want this to be as flexible as possible so that I'm not putting torque into my string. So that's the reason that I pull the core out of that. I've had people say, doesn't your D-loop wear out? Have you had issues with it breaking? I've never had issues with my D-loop breaking, and I've been doing this for 10 plus years with this method of pulling that core out the center. So that's how I like to do it. All right, so for the next step, I'm just going to take one end and I'm just going to use my finger to flatten that out and kind of mushroom it. I'm going to make sure that I've got a good mushroomed piece there at the end. And then I'm going to take a lighter and just simply kind of melt that. As I melt that out, you can see it's kind of starting to form that big flattened off mushroomed end. And then when I feel like I've got to a spot I want to, I'm just going to take my finger and flatten it. All right, so I've got one end that's flattened out right there. My next step is I'm just going to make a loop in it like this. I'm going to stick it underneath the string. So a right-handed shooter, I'm going to stick it underneath the string. I'm going to feed both ends back through the loop. And instead of pulling those both tight, I'm just going to take the one end that I haven't burned yet. I'm going to pull that snug. And what that's going to do is it's going to cinch this piece up. So you've got the mushroom end right here on the opposite side of the bowstring. As I do that, I'm just going to kind of pull it tight. And it doesn't have to be super tight, but just snug for starters. I do like to leave a knock in when I'm tying a D-loop, just for reference. I don't want my knock to pinch, so as I come to full draw and that angle decreases, I don't want it to pinch my knock, so I do want to leave just a slight gap between my D-loop on the top and my knocking point. So as you tie your D-loop in here, you can see you want the burned off mushroom piece here to the outside, and then the piece of the D-loop that's going to go up and over and tied to the bottom closest to the knock itself. So as you look at that, you can kind of see how that looks. You've got the piece running up and over on the inside. You've got the burned off mushroom part to the outside of that D-loop. All right, so as I do this back half of the knot, I'm going to take this piece here. I'm going to go to the outside of the string. I'm going to wrap it underneath. I'm going to take the loose end here. I'm going to run it up underneath that loop. I'm going to kind of pull it in, and after that, you can kind of see what that looks like. I'm then going to take this loose end. I'm going to wrap it around this side and up and under, and then feed this loose end through that loop that you just created. So essentially what you're doing is you're creating a mirror image of what you did on this side, only opposite on the bottom part of that knot. And for a right-handed shooter, this is the way I like to tie in my D-loops, with the knot looking like this on the upper side of the D-loop, and then the lower portion knot looking like this on the lower portion. You can kind of see they're opposite of each other, just exactly opposite. All right, so I've got my D-loop on the string. My next step is I'm going to take a pair of pliers. This is a pair of Easton pliers, which have been built specifically for helping you tie a D-loop. You can see you got a couple of grooves right there on either side of the needle nose pliers. You're just going to drop that into the serving, put the other end into your D-loop, and you're just going to kind of stretch that out. You can see how much that's going to elongate as you pull that in. Like I said, I like my D-loops maybe 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. Those are going to stretch a little bit as you start to draw your bow and shoot it quite a bit, but for me that's probably a good starting point. My next step would be to then take the loose end here. I'm going to cut this D-loop. I'm going to leave myself enough that I can flatten it out and mushroom it and then burn it, and then I'll use the pliers to suck that in tight. You can do this entire step. You know, you can cut you a piece of D-loop, you can burn it from both ends to this exact length, and then you could just tie it on, tighten it, and you'll be good to go. When I'm first setting up a bow, you know, this is how I typically do it, especially for somebody else that you know, may like a D-loop a little bit longer length. So I'm going to mushroom that out just like I did the first one. Make sure that I've got a good portion of material that's kind of mushroomed and pushed out at the top. And then I'm going to take my lighter and I'm just going to kind of work that down until I get a nice top where it's not going to pull through. So like I said, the last step for me, I've got my D-loop on, I've got it completely set up. I'm just going to take these pliers and I'm going to put some more pressure on it between the string and the D-loop, kind of stretch it out, get it to where it's nice and tight. That's almost perfect length for me. And at that point, I've got my knocking point set, I've got my D-loop tied. I'm going to move on to my next step, which is going to be to install the rest. I'll put it in the bow vise and I'm going to level everything up. So I'm going to set my arrow at a 90-degree angle to the string. I've already got my knocking point ready to go. So that's the next step. You know, you can jump in and join us here in a second. I'm going to put my rest on and, you know, show you how I essentially set my rest up.